Thank you, Graham. Is this all working? I think so. Great to be back. This is my second visit to Bath. I came here 5 years ago, I think, to talk at that time around some issues that I was working on history and development policy. But I'm going to talk today about, as the title suggests, invoking a Dickensian kind of theme, about this apparent paradox between the fact that the world in many respects has never been better with regards to the basic indicators we have of human well-being, and yet has never been in more need of a more robust set of public institutions for delivering on the next round of development. And so I'm going to use that sort of juxtaposition or that apparent paradox between how we've got a world simultaneously looking okay through one set of lenses and yet looking pretty fragile on another set of lenses to try and look at some alternatives for how we might go about crafting a very different approach to development as it pertains to the building of states that are capable of doing more and more difficult tasks. So what I'm going to do is go through these some basic sort of facts, as it were, regarding how these development indicators have gone over the last century, but also even longer than that in some cases. But then also look at three different examples of the types of tasks that states are asked to perform, from very routine tasks like delivering mail to very complicated tasks like regulating multinational companies, and look at some of the big holes that exist in the capability of these organizations to deliver on many of their core mandates. I'll then give you 5 reasons why I think this really matters. Why it's on the one hand great to celebrate what the world collectively has been able to achieve by improving these development indicators, but also why we need to be deeply concerned about why there's this big deficit with regard to the capability of public organizations to deliver on their core mandate. I'll try and explain how this apparent paradox came to be and how it endures, and what we might then do to try and move from a world in which many governments look like states, but actually don't function like one, and how that particular dynamic has been sustained by donor agencies, including the World Bank, but also then what might be done. And I'm going to outline in very brief form an approach to institution building that, with my colleagues at the Kennedy School and the World Bank, we are calling problem-driven iterative adaptation, PDIA. So that's the basic roadmap for where we're going to go for the next hour or so, and then we'll have hopefully some time left over for some questions at the end. So that's what we're going to do. As Graham indicated, I work in the research department of the World Bank, just to give you a better sense of where I sit in the vast assemblage of that big organization. As of today, it's probably been literally reconfigured and reorganized under the new president, but as of today, it exists as a big matrix with big sectors, the big specialties, areas of development activity on the columns, as it were, and then the rows built around the different regions of the world. So staff exist at different points at the intersection of that matrix. The research group sits outside of that structure, and it's essentially a very large economics department. There's about roughly 100 professional staff, which makes it the biggest group of development researchers working anywhere in the world. It's mainly economists. It's actually 99% economists and one lone sociologist, and you're looking at that person. So I'm the outlier or the statistically insignificant person in the representative of the statistically insignificant discipline, depending on how you cut it. But for the last 16 years, it's been my job to try and not only bridge the world of scholarship and the world of practice, but also to try and bridge the worlds of economic scholarship and the world of other social sciences, and including law as well, which is what I've been doing a lot through the Justice for the Poor program. That's basically where I sit. But my current preoccupation, which comes out of a decade or more of trying to look at transitions in local justice systems. Graham mentioned the Justice for the Poor program that I helped set up 11 years ago. It's a major research program in the world trying to look at the ways in which prevailing systems of indigenous dispute resolution, customary law in its sort of most folk sort of form, engages with the state and with other forms of power, whether those be multinational companies, mining companies, or other international groups. So there's a very big arena in which a lot of unhappy activity takes place. When multinational companies are doing deals with village chiefs in countries like Vanuatu or the Solomon Islands, Papua New Guinea, or in Liberia and Sierra Leone, these are countries in which there is vast inequities between the resourcing and the power that groups can build, and so can bring together to try and resolve the disputes. And a large part of what we've been trying to do is to figure out how you can create, how donor agencies can create a space wherein slightly more equitable engagements between these very different modalities of dispute resolution might start to articulate. But it's through that process of looking at the way in which legal reform is conducted around the world, whether it be in the fields of constitution building, or in labour law, or in just very everyday forms of dispute resolution. The law is really at the epicenter of a lot of how these transitions are managed, and the international community, as we'll see, has a very spotty, at best, record of engaging with these tasks that, in boilerplate form, come down to imperatives to build the rule of law or to enhance good governance. We have a very ordinary record in that, and part of the reason for that is because it's just so damn difficult to do it. We have, as we'll see shortly, pretty spotty record even in the simple things we try and do, or the relatively straightforward logistical tasks that we try to undertake. But the challenges become even greater once we get into the world of trying to engage with justice reform, with legal reform, governance reform. So that's where I come from, and then it's with combination with colleagues working on public financial management at Harvard and health and education at Harvard as well, that we've started to recognize that a lot of what we're seeing in these different areas in which we work actually have a lot in common. The basic symptoms for how the international aid community interprets these problems, the kinds of modalities by which they engage with them, the way in which they try and implement their responses to them, and then the way in which they try and assess whether and how these interventions have worked, have a very particular common structure to them. And indeed, we will argue, and we have done, that this sequence and this structure is itself part of the problem. Okay, so let me just start off here. The average person, basic indicators of human well-being have never been better, in essence. Right? If you look at the Millennium Development Goals, with some notable exceptions around maternal mortality and a few others, except for the very fragile states, the very high conflict-prone states, in many respects, there's a lot to celebrate with regards to the Millennium Development Goals. Now, there's a separate discussion to be had around the utility of those goals themselves, whether they were the right ones, whether they were the right measures, etc., etc. But they're what we have, and if you just take those at face value, it's pretty hard not to be pretty impressed in most times, in most places, with the extent to which those goals have been met. If you look at simply at the volume of butts on seats, at the level of actual kids that are now going to school. Right? One of the facts that comes out of a new book that my colleague Len Pritchard has just done on education shows that the average levels of education in Bangladesh now are higher than they were in France in 1960. Right? It's remarkable. 50 years later, we have more kids sitting in seats and more kids on average in terms of the years of schooling they've completed than France in 1960. Right? If you look at the relative $1 a day or $1.25 a day poverty measures that we use to assess changes in the most destitute contexts around the world, certainly in Asia, but even in Africa, the relative levels of poverty are going down. There's a qualification around absolute, because in some cases, certainly in Africa, the number of people that are actually in deep poverty is rising, but the relative proportion of any given population living in these most destitute of circumstances is actually going down. The people that have studied health, most recently Angus Deaton in his new book, articulate very powerfully that the kinds of diseases that were even common in the lives of many people in this room, like polio, for example, are just now pretty much, if not entirely, certainly vastly less prevalent than they ever were. Famines are much less common, certainly from the mid-20th century onwards. There's a lot to be very happy about, right? If you invoke Ian Drury in the blockhead, so right? Reasons to be cheerful, part 4. There's a lot to be really happy about what's been going on. So if you're a student and you're sort of having to talk with parents or with friends who are sort of AIDS skeptics or people that think that we're not making a difference in the world in terms of basic indicators of human well-being, I think it's just simply really not true. There's no question that that most of these basic indicators are all heading in the right direction, and that in many respects they're exceeding what we thought they would. And other just basic statistics, like over the course of the 20th century, the average life expectancy of anyone anywhere in the world has more than doubled, right? Or basically doubled. So these kinds of things are very hard to argue with. Right? So in one sense, as I said, we live in the best of times. Now just looking at some, sort of, we go to the aggregate level and look at this across many centuries. The Nobel Prize winner Robert Fogel produced an underappreciated book, I think nearly a decade ago now, but he was looking at this 4-century period from 1700 to 2100. And if you look at the basic story that he's telling, pretty much in 1700, nearly everyone was basically poor. And now we're in a world where still a lot of people are poor, but vastly less than ever was before. The challenge that everyone in this room faces, the challenge that our generation faces, is essentially which way that graph's going to go. Right? If you just take the data at face value, pretty hard not to say that it's going to continue along, and by the year 2100, Fogel's demographic prophecy will essentially come true, that most people in the world won't actually be poor anymore. But one of the, I think, the lessons of history is that none of these things are preordained. We've tried to blow up the world twice. People in Washington are trying to do it as we speak. There's nothing inherent in the way that the world is unfolding that means that these nice things will continue. They have in the past unraveled. They could well do so again. And that would be a great human tragedy. But the real challenge that we face in the next, over the course of the professional lifetimes of most people in this room, is to move into the fourth quarter, as it were. So go into this final challenge knowing that we still have an enormous amount of work to do, but that we also have to consolidate what's already been attained. So it's an open question as to which direction that's going to go. But I also argue that, as much as there is many reasons to be cheerful, not just 4, there's not hundreds and thousands of millions of reasons to be cheerful, because the world is, I think, unambiguously a better place than it was before. But the capability of states to implement their core responsibilities remains disturbingly low. I'll show you some slides shortly on some tests that have been done on the most simple of tasks, the most non-controversial, purely logistical tasks that governments around the world perform, like delivering mail, through to the complex tasks that I will show you some data from, looking at the measures we have around the quality of government from various different places around the world. For now, though, just let me refer you to a wonderful book that came out last year by Akhil Gupta called Red Tape. And there's the wonderful cover on the book that amply demonstrates. It's a huge, big challenge in a country like India and a whole bunch of other places to go from a world in which so much of the political energy is concentrated on getting progressive reforms passed. And Gupta's book is essentially an ode to or the frustrations accompanying his passage, or his coverage of a large social welfare program in India, which is incredibly progressive on paper. Right? On paper, it's targeted towards women over 50 who don't have too many children and who don't have much land. Right? So that, as a demographic category in a country with over 1 billion people, that's a very progressive social policy to have passed. Right? So if you're an elderly, in effect, by Indian standards, an elderly woman who doesn't have a lot of children who can support her in her old age, and you don't have a lot of land that you could either sell or just use for your own food production, highly likely that you're going to be very poor, or at least at risk of being poor. Gupta's book, as an anthropologist, just follows this whole chain, tries to go out, he goes out into the field and looks at the way this otherwise very progressive policy does not get implemented. And why does it not get implemented? Because the basic administrative infrastructure of the state to deliver this program is just not there. Right? So determining whether someone is a woman or not, that's relatively straightforward. But the much harder task is age. Right? Now, it's targeted for women aged 50. But most Indians, certainly most rural Indian women, do not have any form of identification that can prove to themselves or to anybody else how old they are. Indeed, in many of the communities in which Gupta works, the concept of a birthday doesn't even exist. Right? People don't celebrate birthdays in ways that everybody in this room presumably does. Moreover, if I was to challenge you on how old you are, you can whip out your driver's license or your student ID card, and within 3 seconds you can legitimately demonstrate to the world and to anybody who challenges you just how, in fact, old you are. But all of this big social policy rollout is coming unglued because the women who present themselves to the frontline Indian administrative officer can't prove how old they are. And they say they're 52, but someone at the back of the line who doesn't like them says, no, she's lying, she's actually 48. And there's this nice little subtext, a riff in the book all about these people these doctors that have developed this uncanny ability to be able to sort of look at people and be able to discern their age to within 3 months, right? But that's what the implementation of this program ends up turning on, is people developing these kinds of exotic skills to be able to determine people's age, when in any fully functioning state, something like that could be done in 3 seconds, right? How many children does she have? Well, she says she only has 2, but someone else yells back, no, she's actually had 4. Right? How much land does she have? Well, she's not supposed to have more than a hectare, but someone else says, no, she's actually got 4. Right? And so the book is this whole deep discussion around how this otherwise very progressive, very noble, very supportable and good program just comes unraveled on implementation because the elementary aspects of what it takes to actually deliver this program, the data that is needed, the data sets that would be needed, and the access to it, and the updating of it, all of that just can't happen. So I'm calling that sort of, for present purposes, that's a massive, big program, but as logistics go, one could imagine that sort of problem being fixed. Right? Someone could, in fact, roll out big databases around this, and if you know India at the moment, they are, in fact, under the process of unrolling a massive, big identification program, which I think is a very historically sound and desirable policy initiative. But that's one of those examples of a broader point that I hope you take away from today, that so much of our discussions really turn on policy, right? On what the words are or what the content of the change is. And in most countries, changing the policy can be pretty safely assumed to correspond to changes in behaviour, changes in action, changes in decisions that frontline administrators of this thing called the policy will actually do. But in many developing countries, that basic infrastructure to turn this thing called policy into something that a poor elderly, not too many children, not too much land woman can actually secure by way of a public benefit to help her in her old age, just comes unraveled. Right? So this is the big problem that I want to try and focus much more of the development community's focus on. It's not so much these bigger questions down the track of evaluation, those are true as well. I'll have a bit to say about that shortly, but trying to put a much bigger focus on this missing middle, right? A lot of brain power goes into the policy. A lot of cool kids in development these days worry about sort of doing randomized control trials in the evaluation space, but somehow this whole big missing middle just isn't being filled out. And I thoroughly recommend Gupta's book in that spirit, because it's all about this, the local politics and of implementation, and how the absence of an adequate administrative infrastructure means that this stuff all comes unglued, no matter how noble and progressive it might otherwise be. But let's just look at this even simpler task, right? I call delivering the mail a simple task, not because it actually is simple, right? It's logistically still pretty complicated, but it's simple in the sense that there's pretty elementary rules to follow, right? Look at address. Our address and postcode corresponds in a coherent administrative space to an address and to a house, and a post officer essentially just has to read that address and deliver the mail, right? Moreover, nobody doesn't want their mail delivered, right? In ways that powerful companies might not want themselves regulated, or we as taxpayers might not want to be taxed above certain thresholds. There might be some resistance to that. No one doesn't want their mail delivered, right? So testing out the capability of governments to do mail delivery is a really good baseline measure, I think. Just a simple illustration rather than a bigger story, but some colleagues at Harvard last year performed a very nice natural experiment. They delivered 10 unintelligibly addressed envelopes to 157 countries in the world that were signatories to an international postal union agreement which says, simply, if you receive address that is unintelligible, you stick it back on the plane from whence it came, or send it back to the sender, right? That's it. 157 countries have agreed, yes, when we receive a non-intelligible address, we will just simply return it to sender. Right? So they sent out 1,570 unintelligibly addressed letters to these 157 countries, and then set their stopwatches and waited to see how long it would take for any or most of these letters to come back. Right? And if you look at this is the bottom half of the countries by schooling, the first little bar there on the group. The lowest 25 countries, this went into a black hole. There's nothing ever returned. If you look at it by schooling, a fifth of these envelopes never came back at all. And you can go on by extension. And it wasn't just the usual suspects either. We've got any Czechs or Finns in the room, they can take some moment of glory. But the countries like, not just these very poor and conflict-affected countries, but even places like Russia and Egypt and Nigeria, places that you would think would have a pretty well-established capacity to carry out this particular simple task, can't do that, right? So this is the world we live in, right? This world where we've got lots of good things happening, lots of aggregate indicators to celebrate in some macro trend, the big secular shifts a la Robert Fogel's kind of curve, and yet these very middle-ranging programs like Gupta's studies in India, where this all comes unglued, very simple tasks where this becomes not even able to be done either. The last one is just looking at a data set that has been assembled by some colleagues in Sweden, and the quality of government ratings. We're all into different league tables no matter where you are these days, so we can do the same thing with looking at the quality of governments around the world, looking at where they were initially, and then looking at also, and that's the vertical column, where these countries were now and sort of how fast they've gone over the preceding decade. And the very distressing reality is that fully 68 out of the 98 countries, so more than 2/3 of the countries in the world are either falling fast or falling with regards to the quality of the governments in their society. Right? So these are very, very, I think, disturbing figures. Right? And they create a paradox that we have to try and explain. Because how have we been able to achieve these good things in aggregate in development, and yet how has it occurred simultaneously with development indicators around governance that seem to only be heading, or mostly heading south, or stagnating over long periods of time. In the paper from whence this particular table comes, we've done a whole series of other different simulations looking at some of the trajectories in different countries over time. We've come up with some back-of-the-envelope indicators for how long, at present rates, for example, it will take a country like Haiti to get to even a moderate income country like India, right? And you just heard me give a tale of woe from India's capable state, right? But it's going to take 200 years, even at the current pace, for Haiti to look like India, let alone for India to look like Singapore, or for Singapore to look like Finland and the Czech Republic, right? So these pace of change for the countries that are where poverty continues to be most desperate is just vastly inadequate to the tasks that need to be accomplished. Now, I'm going to give you 5 reasons why I think this matters, right? To invoke Robert Frost, not just Charles Dickens. I think we've still got miles to go before we sleep, right? As I mentioned before, the current poverty data that's used by the World Bank and that's collected by my immediate colleagues who work there assumes that at a nutritional level at least, the bare minimum that people can get by on is $1.25 a day. But even if we took an OECD standard of $10 a day, right, do the basic mathematics on $10 a day, it's about £2,000 a year, right? Even by that, if we use that, and that's still miserably poor. No one in this room, even in the most frugal student, could get by on £2,000 a year, right? 80% of the world still remains poor, right? So yes, it's great that we don't have pandemic diseases, we don't have these big wars going on around, which I'll get to shortly, but I still think that holding to $1.25 a day standard is just ethically and morally and in all other ways just vastly inadequate to what I think the true vision of development is, to at least get people to a level of dignity. And even at $10 a day standards, I think we would still argue that we're vastly short of people truly living a full and flourishing life. Accompanying with all of these average shifts is a very persistent, durable inequality, to use Charles Tilley's term, right? Or as Lant Pritchett put it a while ago, still have divergence big time, and it steadily is marching on, right? So these big averages nonetheless reflect big standard deviations. And for the bottom billion, as Paul Collier called them, and as many others have noted as well, there are these countries like Haiti, or pockets within countries like India and Pakistan and elsewhere, where for all of these good things that are occurring on average, in the lived experience of many poor people, things have either stagnated or still continue to get worse. One of the things that globalization does, point 3, I think, is to heighten the mismatch between people's awareness of what life could be and what their actual lived everyday experience actually is. So whether it's through mobile telephones or the internet or television or anything else, this mismatch between people's what they're promised and what they live, I think, is very much a salient part of the political dynamic. What we see going on in the Arab Spring right now, for example, is a serial regime change that's occurred in countries where actually things are improving. Right? If you look at the those welfare indicators that I mentioned at the start, pretty much every single country in the Middle East and North Africa has seen a steady increase. Right? Not fast enough, according to the citizens themselves, rightly enough, but it's this wedge between what people expect and what their systems deliver for them that nonetheless is a source, I would argue, of deep political instability. And so you combine these durable inequalities with political instability, and you have a very toxic combination of people very legitimately perceiving that the world they live in is deeply unjust. And that is, as it has always been, from Machiavelli through de Tocqueville, every serious political theorist has noted that schism, that wedge between expectations and reality has always been, and as it continues to be, and very much in our lifetime, a source of deep instability. My fourth point of why we should worry about this is that what got us here won't get us there. Right? One of the things that I think has meant that one of the reasons that's underpinned the rise in these human welfare indicators is that we've just stopped doing obviously atrocious things. We've stopped slaughtering en masse our own people, as Steven Pinker's book, The Better Angels of Our Nature, amply documented. The incidence of violent conflict around the world over the centuries, and even over the second half of the 20th century, has really just stopped happening. We don't have these big famines anymore, like the tens of millions of people that died in China, for example. We've also done, I think, we've done a lot of very elementary and good things, but which we can call as low-hanging fruit, right? Many of you who have been to a developing country village, for example, will note that it's very common, almost routine, to see people boiling water before they cook food and brushing their teeth before they go to bed, right? Now, those two things have unambiguously done enormous amounts to improve oral hygiene and to be able to ensure that the basic sanitation and water that people have available to them means their kids don't die. Right? Those are very simple, now very widespread practices that have stopped people dying literally like flies, that have meant that Bangladeshi women now only have 3 kids, when even a generation ago they were having on average of 6. Right? All these big demographic trends can be brought down, I think, as they have been, by stopping doing obviously silly things like slaughtering your own people, right? And by doing some pretty simple, widespread things like hand washing. Right? Those kinds of things can really stop a lot of the big vectors of disease and of violence that have been the horsemen, the apocalypse of human history. Right? Stop doing those things, and you can go from pretty low baselines to a step change. And I think we've seen a lot of those step changes over the course of the lifetime of some of the older grey-haired people in this room, even if you're 20 years old. Since the 90s, many of these big changes have occurred. The end of communism, the end of socialism has unambiguously, I think, put in motion these Schumpeterian forces, but on average, a lot of people have benefited from that. The on average problem is that it creates these big inequalities, and people are aware of these big inequalities, and that's what creates these big sources of instability. So finally, I think because of what needs to happen for this next stage, to go from the first step, as it were, to take these next steps in development, to go from not doing silly things to actually doing constructively positive things, and actually getting administrative systems that can accurately determine the age of people, that can actually determine how much land they have. For all these next big rollouts of the large-scale social programs that are going to be needed to ensure that 80% of the teachers that are currently absent from class on any given day in most developing countries actually show up for work, right? Those aren't going to be fixed by hand washing. It's not going to be fixed by inoculating babies, which is another big thing that's happened. Immunization is a huge, unambiguous source of welfare enhancement in the developing world. Right? But all those kinds of tasks are logistical tasks. And the really big accomplishments of certainly the rise of the Western countries and what we've seen in the middle income countries was moving away from, moving steadily, building upon the initial changes to building capable governments that were able to actually then start doing the heavy lifting of poverty reduction. Right? It's not just glorified charity now. Creating what South Korea has done, what Singapore has done, what Taiwan has done, which is to build states that are actually able to move millions of people, 50, 80% of their population out of poverty, not just targeted particular groups from miserable Hobbesian level poverties to slightly better than that, okay? Even though that's important. And I think another problem finally that we have, which I'm going to move on to now, is that how we actually do that has not been the epicenter of the focus of development. It's been much more worrying about whether people were above or below this unbelievably low poverty line. And even when we did argue about questions about good governance or effective states or building the rule of law and other slogans that we come up with these things, we have pretty weak theory and very blunt instruments for doing any of this work. It's pretty hard to name an effective rule of law project, for example, that's happened in the developing world, or any external intervention that has been part of the process whereby a country with very low capability government's been steadily able to improve because of, or as a result of, the kind of support that they might have received from the donor community. So we in the development business, and those of you in the next generation preparing for a career in this field, as I said to the group this afternoon, I think this is really where the 21st century development problem lies, is figuring out how to take these next steps in poverty reduction, which as much as it's important to do this very targeted work on particular people living in particular places, the really big gains in human welfare are going to come when we figure out how to build effective states that are actually able to undertake these, everything from the simple tasks like the mail to the moderate tasks like the social welfare programs to the very complicated tasks like legal and governance reform. Okay, so what do we do? Well, the implications of what I've said are that we need to have, I think, better theory, better strategies, better instruments, and better data. So that's what a researcher says. So with that hat on, I'm now going to try and just walk through that and then put my practitioner hat on and then sort of say, okay, well, how do we turn all of that into something that might actually have some traction, right? So the first thing we need is better theory. We need to have good explanations of the past and present as a guide for a future. We have to be able to explain this paradox that I've just outlined to you. Why is it actually, or how is it rather, that governments have been able to engage in the logic of development, receiving millions of dollars in donor funds, and yet for things like institutional reform and capacity building and the like, and yet have seen their institutional quality flatline or go down. We have to have a good theory to be able to explain that, and I don't think we do. Whatever theory we come up with has to lead to a better strategy, a better way of engaging with any particular country government or a regional or even city government that is politically supportable and administratively implementable. Right? So when we're teaching this at the Kennedy School, this is a big thing. We emphasize that whatever you come up with, it has to be able to find a way of being able to garner the necessary political support to be able to sustain itself over the life that you envision for it, and it has to be an administrative apparatus that underpins it to be able to make sure it actually happens. And that these particular strategies need to not only be focused on questions of design, which I've already emphasized, and evaluation at the end, but this issue that Gupta alerts us to, this big, big question of how we construct the mechanisms for implementation. In turn, this has to give rise to things that frontline practitioners and leaders within governments or in development agencies themselves can actually do. So I will get to that shortly. But part of that was also just, again, this is what pointy-headed researchers have to say, is that we need better data, because a lot of this is happening in a data-free zone. It's happening in places where we often don't have a lot of real-time material to help us out with this. But my qualifier on that is that not only does this, we need summative and real-time data. Another wonderful book that you should read if you haven't, by Merton Jervins, is called Poor Numbers, and it looks, there's an anthropology of the sausage-making process by which the aggregate economic GDP per capita data is collected, which is the one set of indicators that we have for most countries. Right? And it's just a sordid tale, essentially, of how these numbers are, in some cases, literally cooked up for organizations like the World Bank in order to be able to appease the imperatives that go with that. So that's the nasty side. The more neutral sort of position on this is to say it's just really hard to build an administrative system that's capable of having fine-grained data analysis, right? It's unlikely that a state is going to be able to have the data that you, the researcher from a nice university like Bath, wants to have to do your research, and that will have that data but won't be able to also run a hospital, won't be able to run a school system for millions of kids, right? Collecting data, if anyone who's done that, is just an incredibly intensive, skilled, contentious process. You require state capability to collect data, not just to be able to make discernments about whether your indicators are going one way or another. So I think that's actually one of the big tasks that we at the World Bank focus on, is how do we actually help country governments to do a better job at being able to collect this very rudimentary even data around infant mortality, around level baskets of income that people have, etc., etc. So better data, but with a big qualifier that in itself actually requires a deep set of capacities to do it really well. Now, when the prevailing model of the basic logic of the development system we now work within, the institutional aid architecture, if you like, when it engages in development, particularly as it pertains to the reform of institutions, it has a particular structure to the way it works most of the time. This is not, this is simplified for the sake of presentational purposes, but the logic of how we, the World Bank, and you, DFID, and with my AusAid hat on from Australia, we do the same thing. There's pretty much a core logic for how we go about doing these kinds of things. And I think this particular approach that I'm going to outline here helps explain why millions of dollars can keep being given out every year while there's actually very little functional improvement in the institutions that are overpinning this. Why we can go through literally 20 years of almost an identical project loan to Kenya, for example, on institutional reform in the education space that is literally almost cut and pasted from previous iterations. All right, and how we're able to create a world where the data look like something's improving when functionally it's actually not. Right? Now, one of the ways that happens is that we, I think, have a very powerful mismatch between, or at least we have a very powerful assumption that function follows form. That what something looks like is in essence what enables it to do what it does. Okay? So in social theory, you have a very fancy term for this called isomorphic mimicry. It means you look like what you think you want to look like as part of a process by which you hope eventually to become this thing. It actually comes out of Silicon Valley amongst venture capital firms that back in the 80s when this theory was first articulated. Sociologists were wandering around looking at how venture capitalists who were trying to pitch their idea to rich philanthropists or venture capitalists about why their idea was great. And what they would do at the time was just make their little garage or their little business look like Apple, right? Because they knew that Apple was the cool kids that were doing everything that was innovative in the world of high tech. So if when the venture capitalists were walking around your office, you looked like Apple, that was sort of sending a signal that you were kind of actually Apple, right? So isomorphic mimicry is actually very pervasive throughout, not just poor countries or through the private sector, it's right through universities, it's right through everywhere. I'll give you an example from the work we've done in Sierra Leone, in Solomon Islands, part of in Melanesia in the northeast northeast coast of Australia. One of the biggest sources of donor assistance to Solomon Islands over the last 10 years has been through the Regional Assistance Mission to try and consolidate the ceasing of the civil war that broke out there about 8 or 9 years ago. And what was the big thing that the Australian government did? Well, the big problem was deemed to be the absence of a justice system. Right? Well, what do justice systems look like? Justice systems have court buildings with guys with wigs and black robes that sit in them, and they sort out the good guys and the bad guys, and they send the bad guys to things called jails. Okay? So literally, AusAid spent hundreds of millions of dollars, and if you go to some of the islands of Solomon Islands today, you will see a state-of-the-art, eco-friendly, locally sourced, perfectly procured, not a dot wasted in corruption, courthouse sitting there, right, that costs $240 million. And around the corner is a state-of-the-art jail that houses 8 people, but has a weights room because the international codes require that you have exercise facilities. It's wonderful. No one could ever complain about this sort of cramming people into jails and all these other awful things, right? But the fact is we've spent, $400,000 producing a court that meets twice a year and a jail that houses 8 people. Why? Because we can do that. We can build systems that look like modern legal systems. We can build jails that look like jails. We can build courthouses that look like courthouses, and yet go around a third corner and see the local police chief with 800 files stacked in his corner that's unable to be resolved because there isn't any viable procedure in and through which this backlog of cases can be addressed. The tiny fraction of those that might be deemed admissible through a formal court, yes, we in the West can provide you with the court systems and the training of judges and everything else you might want to do to solve that problem. But if the actual problem you face is much lower down, is much more in the murky anthropological world of oral legal systems trying to negotiate very complicated solutions to complicated problems, then we don't know what to do about that. Right? But we can spend lots of money, very faithfully as far as the accountants are concerned, building systems that look like systems that don't actually function like them. Right? So those are the examples that I'm using. But that's a very pervasive problem of this isomorphic mimicry. Uganda, for example, since I've got it up on the board, Uganda scores 99 out of 100 on the quality of its anti-corruption law by the watchdog group around the world that scorecards the quality of the text that each country has regarding its corruption law. Right? I was in Uganda this time last year in a moment of perverse beauty. The day we show up, the headlines on the national newspaper are literally $280 million in aid to be cancelled by DFID because of corruption. So you can have laws that look fantastic, that scorecard you as a world-class anti-corruption legal system that just doesn't hold literally a dime with regards to actually stopping the corruption system going on. So we have these parallel worlds essentially going on in development. We have the world of data being produced and systems and buildings and organizational changes occurring that all is done to satisfy external imperatives for measurability and accounting and whether things look like we want them to look like, and a parallel world where the real budgeting goes on, where the real justice is dispensed, where the real organizational incentives and imperatives lie. And if we only measure the first lot and don't really worry about the second stuff, we can still see trends increasing. We can happily dispense millions of dollars in lending and see very little change in the actual way in which these systems function. The second characteristic is that we largely assume that it's our job as people with PhDs from nice universities to fly into these countries and determine what the problems are, right? And to see like a state, and Jim Scott's famous rendering of this, to be able to see the problems that we have, that we want to solve in terms of the solutions we happen to have. And I think one of the perverse consequences of a deep focus on using systematic reviews and on using only very narrow forms of claiming to assess the quality of the interventions that we use is that we end up reverse engineering a lot of our development around we use the solutions we have to determine the kinds of problems we see, essentially. Thirdly, we focus largely on the inputs delivered, not on the actual outcomes. So many of the Millennium Development Goals, for example, fit this kind of pattern. The most obvious and egregious was probably the butts on seats measure for education, right? You can tell wonderful stories about how many kids allegedly now show up to actually go to school on any given day, but the PISA test, the international tests that are done on every country, most countries around the world to try and test out what kids actually know as opposed to how many hours they actually spent in the classroom, right? Those are diabolical. Over the last 10 years, flatline or even declining in countries like India. Show a child, for example, the basic box with a grid, with a four-way, divided into quarters, and shade one of those quarters. Ask your average grade 5 child in India what percentage of this box, of this larger box is now shaded in, right? 25%, right? Only 15% of kids can actually get that right, right? Just extraordinary. And so Steve Lant-Pritchett's most recent book on this, which just goes through a litany of these kinds of examples of where the inputs, the number of textbooks we've provided, the number of schools we've built, the amount of chalk we've provided, right? All these things that are very countable, very easy to measure and very observed can just exist in an entirely different universe from what we think we're actually trying to do, which is to help kids learn. Right? There's fourthly, there's just in our reverse engineering nest and in our quest to try and find ever more fine-grained tools for doing this kind of work, we engage in very cavalier processes of generalizing. Right? So even if we have squeaky clean evidence that what we've tried to do in this country, in this context here, conditional cash transfers in Mexico for poor rural women. We have pretty good evidence that that works in some sense through the particular instruments that we have available for that. But does that rigorous evidence, or that putatively rigorous evidence, validate me putting you on a plane to Madagascar or to Chad to advise them now on the wonders of how they too can improve enrollments in school, right? Very murky world in which we do all of that kind of stuff. But I think any of these big challenges these step change challenges that we face in the space of improving the quality of our state institutions is going to require a much deeper commitment to understanding the idiosyncrasies and the legitimacy, or the processes by which legitimacy is given to or is forged for local institutions as they embark on a process of reform. And to borrow Professor Copestake's wonderful phrase, I think we also just set vastly unrealistic expectations for a lot of this work as well. And that's problematic, but it's problematic politically in the sense that the constant sense of failure that puts in motion delegitimizes the very task of trying to engage in reform in the first place. So once we try and take a Haiti-type problem of 200 years, which has already been independent for 200 years, notionally, when you have these huge big time frames and we try and collapse all of this into a 5-year log frame, which is how most development agencies still run, right? We're just destined to fail. I'm doing a big review at the moment of health and education reform in the Middle East, North Africa region with many colleagues at the World Bank. And just even the last 10 years, the concluding aspect of all this was the expectations were just too high, and we failed, and we failed, and we failed. And we do this all the time. And students of Albert Hirschman will know this has sort of been a repeated pattern forever. And if anyone's tried to get a plumber in to fix their house, you know, there's always this vast mismatch between what we think is going to happen and what actually happens. But in the development community, where the use of public resources is happening, and where the political support for these things is very short term, we delegitimize, I think, this very difficult task of change when we just repeatedly fail in this way. So we call this premature load bearing. Right, so that's the basic sort of model of how we do institutional reform in general. I think largely comports with those 5 characteristics. Now, in trying to then come up with an alternative, in the kind of work that we are now doing, we make no claim to being the first word on this topic. We adopt what I call the second word sort of a stance, which is to say we try to be as aware as we can be of our predecessors who have worked on this issue for a long time, even as we never claim also to be the definitive QED, we've nailed it kind of story. But I think there's elements of this that have been around, not just since Hirschman, even before that, but at least if you look at the business literature, if you look at the academic literature from a bunch of people that I've cited, there's a whole lot of people who've been working on at least articulating the basic dynamic that we've been working on here. We tried to flesh this out in a more fuller kind of sense, but also tried to move it from theory and from analysis, as we'll discuss shortly, into trying to actually do something about this. Let me just give you one example from Toyota of what I'm talking about here, since I think this really embodies some of the really interesting work. Toyota, as you might know, celebrates itself as one of the most reliable vehicle companies in the world. And so the reliability of Toyota is renowned. But one of the really interesting things about Toyota, and on a very famous Harvard Business School case study that was done on this several years ago, was that Toyota was very conscious that you couldn't reduce what they were doing to a script. You couldn't reduce it to a blueprint. You couldn't write it out in text, what they were actually doing. So as in a sort of fascinating sort of natural experiment, they opened their doors for a brief period to executives and even frontline machine operators from Ford and from General Motors in their company in Japan, and said, basically, knock yourself out. Wander around, take photographs, talk to everybody. Look at, it's all open season. We're not trying to hide anything here. Come back and just look at it and see take whatever you want, right? And they actually tried to then, there's actually even a podcast on this done on that National Public Radio in the United States did around this case. So it's famous in multiple domains. But the bottom line is, the people had this open, free access to all this information, and tried to implement it back in their own companies, and actually were worse as a result of trying to implement what they'd seen. Right? And what does that say? I mean, it's basically saying, again, there's this two-level game going on in any of these firms. There's the tacit knowledge going on down here, which you only acquire by experience, only by being part of an organizational system. And there is the blueprint. There is the office employee manual. There is the blueprints, right? Even the US Army does this, would you believe? Most of the US Army's battle strategies you can find without too much difficulty open on the internet. Can you implement them? No. Why can't you implement them? Because they're not reducible just to the words, to the text, to the blueprint. Right? And yet so much of what we do in development really is about trying to change that top level. Right? And if you just change that top level and don't have a proper theory of or strategy for engaging with that other stuff, then a lot of it just doesn't start to break down. Okay, so we have these business school cases, we have academic literature, we even have some recent initiatives in development itself within the World Bank. We've been pioneering what's called results-based management, or the Center for Global Development has been pushing this cash-on-delivery aid idea, where we only reward what people accomplish and we don't really care too much about ex-ante conditionality anymore. Now we're just trying to reward you for what you achieve and have good feedback loops, and so we try to dole out money in that kind of way. But those are still fairly small. They exist, but they're hardly where the center of gravity around our thinking and doing in development lies. So there's plenty of good examples, I guess what I'm saying, from a range of different sources within scholarship, within operations, and within history itself, where we can see examples of this kind of dynamic in play. But how do we turn all of that into something that might actually be supportable? Well, what we've been doing with our work on in the Justice for the Poor program, what my colleague Matt Andrews has been doing on public financial management reform, budgeting reform in Mozambique and elsewhere, what Lance has been doing in health and education, has been to try this particular approach that we're calling problem-driven iterative adaptation, PDIA. At the end of this presentation, I have the slides with all of the sources, documents from this presentation. So if you want to follow up with any of these readings on which I'm drawing, you can go to those there. But the first thing is really trying to break this notion of getting away from experts determining problems, firstly, and then determining problems on the basis of the solution they have. I'm trying to get away from the world in which I have a hammer and so therefore every problem is a nail. Right? How do we actually get people to have the autonomy and the authority to be able to nominate and prioritize their own problems as they understand them? Right? That can take a long time. That's not something that can be done in a week-long mission where a bunch of suits can fly into a capital city, convene a couple of meetings in nice capital cities and determine through a more consultative or participatory process what the problem is. Figuring out what the problem is a very much a month-long process often of trying to actually do this. So when you go to a country like the Solomon Islands with this very strong imperative to produce results now, to produce things that will satisfy the accountants back in Canberra, for example, to actually go and figure out what does the justice problem look like and feel like, how is it experienced by rural and urban folk in countries like Liberia, in countries like Chad, in countries like Vanuatu. How do we actually do that? And not only that, for whom is this a problem? And how do we actually figure that out? Well, with our Justice for the Poor program, it's meant that we've invested enormous amounts of money in having people-based, in doing field-based operational action research, I guess you'd call it, in each of these countries for years at a time. Not just months, not just weeks, years at a time. And some of you know of our work in Indonesia, with the social development program based there, has parades of people going through regularly who are there for years at a time, learning local languages, doing, in essence, sort of applied anthropology to be able to figure out exactly what that work looks like. And it makes for a very stimulating and very professional kind of work environment. But the essence of it is, how do you create a platform where people themselves determine what the problems are that they are facing, and not only determine what those problems are, prioritize them. Say, well, there's any number of problems you might face. What do we focus on first? What's likely to be supportable? Then, secondly, we look at what's called the positive deviance, which is a whole different literature, which we're trying to integrate here. But the essence of the positive deviance approach is to say, whatever it is we're looking at, whatever phenomena we're looking at, there's not only an average, there's a standard deviation. There's always going to be variability. So I mentioned before, for example, the factoid about 80% of teachers not showing up for school. That's an average, okay? In some places it's 90, in some places it's 30, right? So we need to interrogate the standard deviation. We need to try and get a good contextual understanding of why it is that it's even worse in some places and actually almost acceptable in other areas. What's going on there? What are these guys doing over here, either by way of reconfiguring the incentives or the social compacts between teachers and parents, whatever it is. There's something going on that we need to both identify and then use that as the basis for trying to replicate and extend, rather than just keeping on applying these externally determined solutions and which have been verified through researchers, using the local context itself and the variation therein to be able to both identify and then communicate the sources of that variance. Someone, somewhere, somehow has probably found a better way to solve this particular problem. Right? Our instincts as people with fancy degrees from fancy universities, right? We think our job as professionals is to do that, right? That's a very deep professional imperative. That's why we like wearing suits. That's why we like flying and staying in nice hotels. That's what experts do, right? But changing the emphasis around what it means to be an expert in these kinds of problems, I think, is really crucial. Let me add as a footnote here that I think there are problems that very rapidly can and should be copied around the world. As I indicated in my earlier remarks, things like hand washing, things like immunizing babies, those are universally now recognized to be unambiguously good things. We don't need to keep reinventing that solution. The particular space that I'm talking about is this very hyper-complex space of trying to navigate changes in rule systems, in governance systems, and in legal systems. It's that particular modality of reform that I think is best left to this kind of way of doing things. Step 3 then is to sort of try, learn, iterate, and adapt using very high-quality feedback loops in real time to try and get people getting a sense of whether what they're doing is working or not. Again, this might, in a university setting, might sound a little strange, but even now, it is still the dominant modality for the World Bank, and I would suggest most likely as well for many donor agencies, for projects to be years in the making, years in the implementing, and then some cases 7, 8, 9, 10 years later before an evaluation is done to be able to provide some lessons learned for what happened way back there. Right? There's just these big blocks of time where people move on, where careers have risen and fallen, where there's just no plausible way in which any of those lessons will feed back and improve the system. So in another important paper that's come out of our program, which is all about trying to design, how do we build in the high quality feedback loops to help us navigate the design space, as we call it, how to be able to figure out in the space of possibilities for what is politically supportable, how can we look at this standard deviation, identify it, and then build some feedback loops around that as we try and move that in other parts of the country or elsewhere. Then scaling through diffusion, rather than scaling in the usual scaling up sense of just making something small big, right? How do we build a community of practice for routinizing this as a way of doing things? How can we help people to actually think about this as what it means to be a frontline development professional? Well, in our work in the Solomon Islands, this is pretty much how we've been starting to do this work now, with a program built around village facilitators trained enough in customary law and in the formal law to act as mediators between that, but then not to saying, okay, now we've trained you, run off into the field and do your thing, right? Saying this is really hard. Your job now is you're a diplomat, essentially. You're trying to negotiate very complex space. We don't assume that you now have the answer and your job is to implement it, right? You have enough minimal knowledge to be able to be credible to enter that professional space. Now you've entered that space, how do you listen, learn, and iterate your way to something that is supportable and legitimate in that local context? And how, if we do that process through a diffusion, through a community of practice, that's how we think scaling really occurs. If we had to have a tagline for what all this amounts to, it's really saying ultimately that it's the inverse of how we usually think about development. The logic of how development is set up is if we get good institutions, we'll get success. And we get good institutions by building systems that look like good institutions, imagining that that theory of change leads functionally to the higher performance, right? We think it's exactly the opposite. We think we get success. If you look at success and you look at how things are already happening and you then work backwards from that, you will then start to see larger scale forms of success. And there is good, I think, historical examples for that, which I'll come to shortly. But even in but a range of different fields, not just in law, but in health and education, I think demonstrate some of the truth of that statement. Okay, why is this hard? It's very hard for the World Bank. It's very hard for DFID, and it's hard for AusAid. It's hard even for your favorite NGO to do all of this. Why? Because in an age of austerity, even before that, development is a very politically weak field, as it were, right? So we're very bound to be risk averse. Right? We are very vulnerable to a world in which people imagine you're a modal citizen of a rich country thinks that 20% of their national budget is spent on aid, when usually it's around, at best, 3 or 4%. Right? So it's just wild mismatches between what people think aid volumes of spending are, what the reality is. But even then, it's always politically vulnerable. There's always a hard case to be made when existing domestic programs are under assault. Right? So certainly in the US now, and depending on how the questions are phrased, what should be the first thing? If we're going to have to slash the budget, what should we slash? Number one, unambiguously, is always we should slash foreign aid. Well, even if people don't really know what that is. What I'd love to say is, okay, we'll halve it from whatever you think it currently is. Okay, we'll make it 20. Okay, we'll do 10. We'll call it a good 10. But that's not how it works, right? It just means that we're hyper risk averse. We're just we're always living with this threat that we're just working in a field that's a big rat hole, that all this money disappears into nothingness, right? And so part of why I opened with this more upbeat Dickensian story about the best of times was I think that you can tell legitimately a very positive story about the world's aggregate trends, right? But where there is truth in the other half of the Dickensian story is that, as I've tried to articulate, is that we still have, I think, very durable forms and sources of poverty. It's only going to get harder as we move along, and we just don't have the administrative structures to do what we need to do. Even within the space where we're vulnerable, a lot of what we do is very, very hard to assess in the ways that other aspects of public policy can be assessed. Right? So if you are up against a hard-hearted or bean counter who really wants sort of rigorous evidence that what you're doing is working, it's just inherently very hard to do that in development. Even with the roads and engineering and schools and hospitals, things that we kind of even really know how to do, it's really, really hard to, as a social scientist, to be able to come up with a squeaky clean identification strategy, as we call it, to truly show causally that yes, this thing called a development project caused this thing called poverty reduction, controlling for a whole bunch of other things. It's just really hard to do that. It's even more hard when the kind of stuff we're doing falls into this domain that I'm talking about, of governance and legal reform. So one of my favourite quotes attributed to Gordon Brown, though I've never been actually formally verified, but I saw it at a presentation once and thought it was fantastic. The hardest part about building the rule of law is the first 500 years. Right? I live with that, right? This is what Justice for the Poor is in. It's on a 500-year quest, and it's probably going to be a big J-curve, which means in my career I'm going to only see things getting worse, and I'm somehow supposed to imagine or hope that this is a J-curve that'll bottom out and get better. But I think even lightheartedness aside, any serious student of enfranchising women, of ending slavery, all the things that we regard as the great accomplishments of human history were multi-century long, deeply fraught, deeply contentious, often very violent processes of change. And if that's the 21st century challenge, a world that insists on very narrow metrics of success, insists on only doing that which has already been verified to work, right, just really starts to tie hands behind our backs, I think, when we're doing that. But if we want to engage with this, if we want to try and have a reasoned conversation with people whose job is otherwise to be a custodian of the public purse, we have to have better theory, better strategies, better metrics, and better ways of engaging with all of this kind of stuff. So it's not only just these questions of discerning impact is hard, it's even then more complicated, as I indicated before, to start making generalizations about that. And impetus, unfortunately, that I think that we've set up in this age of austerity is a very narrow claiming that we regard as legitimate for making these generalizability claims, right? And I think we as researchers have a lot of work to do in terms of being able to enhance the sophistication of our thinking regarding the generalizability of what we do. So this is really hard, but I think it's not impossible. So let me conclude with some examples from things that are already happening around the world. 2 years ago, when I was at Manchester, we did a book working with the great Chris Bailey from Cambridge, where we commissioned serious historians of the 19th and of the 20th century to tell us actually how it was that this thing called public education and public health was constructed, right? It was not self-evident, for example, that we should build sewers. It was not self-evident that we should build public schools for every person. That was an idea that had to be invented. A social movement had to coalesce around it and had to convince a bunch of skeptical people that was actually a desirable way of spending public money. And it happened. That's the short version. The long versions articulated in the chapters in this book are all about showing just how long and messy a process it was to take something like education, especially in a country like the UK, which initially had a whole array of different private schools and essentially little home-based or community-based schools, and all of those had to be centralised in a very contentious process. Right? It's always been contentious. So being a student of history just, I think, provides some encouragement, actually, about what our forebears went to when they were trying to do really hard things. And we shouldn't be giving up on these really hard things either. Some more applied work that I think that's been done through case study research at Princeton. Just type Successful Societies Princeton into Google. You have this wonderful research project that my colleagues there are working on, looking at what you might call islands of success and seas of failure. Right? They're looking at examples of positive deviators in various different countries, where despite the odds, not just individuals, but teams of people have actually been able to make stuff work. Prosaic things like this one case study, I think, on the post office in northern Jordan, right? Which might strike you as a kind of boring thing. But actually, it's really interesting because the post office kind of doesn't really work in Jordan, and yet these people have figured out how to make something work. There's been other studies done on Laos, on road repair, right? Again, seemingly unbelievably boring, right? But if you're a Minister of Public Works, why would you spend your political capital on boring things like maintaining roads when it's way cooler to be cutting ribbons and paving yet more, chopping down more rainforests and putting raw roads down? So this one guy in Laos managed to actually convince his colleagues, that actually fixing up the holes in the road was actually a really appropriate use of public spending, right? Now, maybe only I'm the kind of person that gets excited about that kind of research, but I think it's really, really useful research because it's figuring out how good leadership has been structured and implemented to make things that are actually necessary, like fixing potholes, and change the political calculus so that we actually do fix the roads rather than just paving yet more ones where it will produce lots of bigger political payoff. Lanyo and Stern, Peter Lanyo, my manager at the World Bank, has been doing work that extends beyond the course of his career, tracing this one village in India called Palanpur. They've now got 60 years of data on this one village in India, right? But there's enormous amounts that they can tell you on the basis of this one village that poor villagers have been studied to death for generations. But it's a marvellous case study of the trials and tribulations of one particular village that's been able to be set up. Now, if you're a methodological purist, you go, it's one village out of a million. How can we possibly draw generalizations from that? Right? Well, there are ways you can do that, and it's the kinds of conversations that sort of research legitimizes by way of looking at these social processes of inequality and different forms of employment that people have, which can be used to facilitate a broader policy dialogue. Our own work in the Justice for the Poor Crow and the bank, wonderful initiative that my colleague Vijendra Rao has set up in India, which is all a similar kind of model to our justice work. Dozens of people living and working in the villages of Bihar around these big social livelihoods programs, all about trying to get real-time data that can help people to solve local problems and move these programs much more rapidly in terms of the prevailing problems that people actually have, not just being faithful implementers of a project that was cooked up in Delhi or in Washington and who think their job is just to make sure that the watchdogs and the procurement people are kept happy. Their actual job is to solve the problems that villagers themselves determine. And this stuff is actually happening within the World Bank. So these are sort of examples of things that are happening. They're by no means should you think this is the way the World Bank functions. I hope you took from my critique, in fact, that these are the exceptions that perhaps prove the rule. These are innovations that have been pioneered over many years by people trying to envision and instantiate a very different approach to thinking about organizational reform, and particularly as it plays out in the local level, and particularly as it plays out in the lives of the rule systems under which people live. So the implications for this, I think, are that we just need a much more diverse approach to the disciplines and methods and the product genres that we work in. Our incentives as researchers is always to publish in very elite places and to have very sort of narrow methodological standards, methodological rules, I guess, that we uphold. When I think a large part of that is itself the problem. When we are not, when we invest too heavily in one at the expense of the other. I think researchers need to get back to thinking about big questions again. Right? There's a wonderful review in a magazine called the Boston Review that Prerna Barden did over the summer, which reviews the latest 4 big-selling books in development by Tim Besley, by Darren Acemoglu on the macro side, and then the poor economics and all the randomized control trials and the other. It's a fantastic review, which I encourage you to read, which is all about, the essence of which is all the people asking big questions are providing unusable answers, and all the people that are providing usable answers are asking trivial questions. I think for research, we've lost that sweet spot. We've lost the courage and the conviction to be able to ask and answer big questions, which leaves us just doubling down on these very narrow, in some cases, virtually trivial kinds of questions. And I think we need to do a much better job of going beyond averages, about being able to exploit these standard deviations, and I think we need to invest much more heavily, especially in junior researchers, of spending them putting them in countries for years at a time, not just weeks or months. From operations, I think we've got a lot of work to do around M&E, this thing called monitoring and evaluation, which is an essential part of the work of any intervention. Even something done here in the UK has an M&E component to it. But we have to add this real-time evaluation component to it, this real-time feedback loop notion. How can we do that? How can we see that? As difficult it is, I think we do actually we can see from the examples I just provided of examples of ways in which that is all happening. Helping people to navigate the fitness landscape, helping them to figure out among the range of possibilities what seems to make sense here for the kind of problem we actually face. And I think we need to see them, the projects themselves, as Dennis Rondinelli said 20 years ago. We need to see these things as policy experiments. We don't need to see them as fiats or dictates or things that we hold slavishly to. We need to see them as instantiations of ideas that need to be able to be moved and adapted in real time to the specific concerns of the particular places and the people that they are engaged with. So that's my big story, right? The big story is essentially a world in which, yes, lots of good things are happening, but we've taken one step. That step is real. That step is a culmination of many centuries, in fact, of enhancements in human well-being. But unless we're happy, as I hope we're not, to settle for unbelievably low standards of poverty reduction as our target, but in fact even set what seems like very ambitious targets, like $10 a day, which is still woefully poor. Right? If we see it through that lens, we've got many, many more steps to go. It's only going to get harder the more we succeed, right? Because we can stop doing obviously silly things. We've done a lot of the work of just rolling out the well-understood things around immunization and sanitation and all that sort of stuff. The really big things that happened to every country that went through a process of being mostly poor to being mostly rich was that it developed a state capable of doing these way more complicated, way more politically contentious tasks that entail pushing back as necessary against forms of very insidious political power, often wielded against the interests of poor people. Right? That is world history, is the history of trying to figure out how to constrain elite power, and yet that's still the 21st century issue I would sustain if we want to see this poverty reduction occurring at large scale. The current models we have for doing this are not doing that. They create a fictitious world in which we can see things changing and count things legitimacy changing because they look like what we want them to look like. But in fact, what's really going on is beneath the radar, beneath the lens, beneath the tools that we have for looking at all of that. To break that cycle, we've got to have a good theory that exposes that dualism and then be able to have a politically supportable and implementable approach to being able to do things very differently. Others have said this for many years. We're now trying to do this in a much more forceful way through the big aid agencies, and many of the things that you guys are, I hope, are engaged in your work here at Bath or elsewhere as part of this renaissance almost, I hope, in development thinking and doing. It's not original. There's a consistent strand of thinking like this for throughout development's history, and I thoroughly recommend you read Albert Hirschman's biography, which is sort of a testament to someone who spent their life trying to live through this kind of process. But in its own way, that's what I think the task is. That's the challenge of the 21st century, is to build institutions, build state organizations capable of doing incrementally more complex and larger scale tasks. We don't know how to do that. I sure as heck don't know how to do that. But that concession itself should be the first one we make, rather than imagining that we do know how to do this kind of stuff. It's just so hard. It's so hard, even for rich countries, still figuring out how to do this. They're figuring this out in Washington as we speak, I pray. Right? It's not over. It's never over. We've invented these things. We've invented a world that enables us to live prosperously. We've invented systems that enable justice to be mediated out more or less equitably. We've invented institutional structures that enable us not to have to live a hand-to-mouth existence. We've got to keep inventing them. We've got to keep adapting them, because the wonder of the human experience is that it's so multifaceted and so multidimensional. And putting all of that into one gridlock or one particular framing and imagining that that is both historically consistent and will actually deliver what we need it to is just both ahistorical and, in its contemporary sense, in fact, itself the problem. These kind of approaches that we're articulating, I think, can be one way of going about this in the future, and I hope you see yourself being part of that and will be able to join us in your own way as we go forward. Thanks very much.